Hi everyone, this is Kirsten Verklas, the Program Director for Electricity at NASEO. Welcome to the Transmission Planning, Coordination, and Comprehensive Electricity Planning webinar, organized by the NARUC NASEO Comprehensive Electricity Planning Task Force. Before we get started, I just wanted to provide you with an overview of who is speaking today. Lorenzo Christoph and Brooke Tucker are our moderators for today, and the speakers are Dan Robichaud. He's the Planner for Policy Regulatory Planning at the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, MISO, followed by Neil Millar, the Vice President of Transmission Planning and Infrastructure Development at the California ISO, followed by Nick Chassette, the Chief Executive Officer of the East Bay Community Energy, and then last but not least, Doug Scott, the Vice President of Strategic Initiatives, Great Plains Institute. We will have all the questions and answers at the end of the presentations. The way you can ask questions is you can either raise your hand by clicking on the hand icon, and then an organizer will call on you and unmute you during the Q&A session. Or you can, at any time, type your question in the question box, and an organizer will read the question during the Q&A portion. Or if it's a question that is at the drives at the comprehension of the slides or is important right away, we will fold that into the presentations as well and make sure that you get your question answered right away. The presentations are available in the handout section of the webinar control panel, and we will also distribute them at the end after the webinar. This webinar is recorded. With that, I will hand it over to Lorenzo Christoph, who is our moderator.
Thank you, Kirsten. And good afternoon, everyone. This is Lorenzo Christoph. I probably know most of you. I'm one of the core team members on the NARUC NASEO Comprehensive Planning Task Force, and glad that you're all able to join us today. We've been working, as you know, to look at integration of distribution planning and resource planning, and many of the participants in the task force have now asked about transmission planning. So we set up this webinar to look at different ways that coordination between what's happening on the distribution side and what happens in transmission planning is being done in different places, with examples that we hope will be useful to you all. As Kirsten said, we'll save hopefully a half an hour for the end from the last 30 minutes of the session for a Q&A discussion. And so hopefully all your questions can be raised and discussed at that time. But if something is really unclear and confusing and it's just bugging you, we can allow for clarification questions sooner than that. So we'll be watching the Q&A box, the questions box, to see if something like that comes up. That's really all I wanted to say by way of introduction. Glad you're all here. I'll start out with introducing the first speaker, who is Dan Robichaud, who's been a planner with the Policy Regulatory Planning team at MISO in system planning since about a year ago. And before joining MISO, he managed environmental programs and projects for air and water quality, critical infrastructure, renewable energy storage at the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality for 5 years. Dan, very glad that you could join us, and please take it away.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Good afternoon, my name is Dan Robichaud. This presentation will briefly discuss DERs and transmission planning at MISO. Next slide, please. To summarize, in MISO economic planning, DERs are captured via future scenarios, and in reliability planning, DERs as defined by NERC are part of modeling. Additionally, we want to emphasize, as the industry evolves, MISO is collaborating with states and member utilities to develop processes for gathering DER data at an appropriate level. To be clear, MISO has no interest in modeling the distribution system. Finally, MISO works with state regulators to ensure jurisdictional boundaries are observed and upheld. Next slide, please. This first slide recaps MISO's DER program session from September 2019. Transmission planning falls into 4 broad categories at MISO: policy assessment, resource planning, economic planning, and reliability planning. For the purposes of today's presentation, we will focus on two main areas: economic planning, which is scenario-based and used to provide economic and market efficiency benefits, and reliability planning, which evaluates the system against national reliability standards, such as those by NERC. These two types have slightly different study timeframes. Reliability planning looks 5 to 10 years in the future, while economic planning reaches out 15 to 20 years. Both culminate in the annual MISO Transmission Expansion Plan, or MTEP, report. Additionally, economic planning can be thought of as a type of regional planning, where long-term plans are based on a range of future scenarios. At MISO, we follow a value-based planning practice whose objective is to develop the most robust plan under a variety of scenarios, not the least cost plan under a single scenario. The best transmission plan may be different in each policy-based future scenario. The transmission plan that is the best fit or most robust against all these scenarios should offer the most value in supporting the future resource mix. In contrast, reliability planning uses power flow and stability studies, has more of a local flavor, and tends to focus on validating the needs for transmission plans that have been identified by MISO transmission owners. Next. For the purposes of economic and policy studies, MISO uses the following definition. DERs are power generation, storage, or demand-side management connected to the electrical system, either behind the meter or on a customer's premises or on a utilities distribution system. Next. As a brief introduction to MISO Futures, we developed the futures to establish ranges of possibilities that, when combined, produce representations of what could be, instead of trying to predict the future. Futures development considers economic, political, and technological changes to model economic generation capacity expansion. This resource expansion forecasts a range of optimal fleet resource mixes, which are used in development of transmission plans and projects. Next. The futures are used in MISO's annual transmission expansion plan, and here's a brief overview of the 3 MTEP 21 futures. Future 1 embodies a business-as-usual scenario, with the footprint continuing development in line with 100% of IRPs and 85% of announcements and goals. Carbon emissions continue their decline and energy increases consistent with current trends. In Future 2, we see a moderate amount of change, with 60% carbon emissions reduction, or CER, and a 30% energy increase due to electrification. Finally, Future 3 depicts a substantial amount of change, with 80% CER and a 50% energy increase. Next. As an example, here are the assumptions and estimates for DER technical potential by the end of the 20-year MTEP Futures study period, developed in consultation with our DER demand-side modeling vendor, Applied Energy Group, or AEG. Without taking too much time on this, generally, since the last cycle, the assessment for demand response has decreased slightly, while the potential for distributed generation has increased substantially, especially for Future 3, the scenario entailing the most change. We will not have final results for DER technical potential until the AEGIS resource expansion runs are completed. Next. You've now heard how DERs fit into the policy planning and economic planning pieces of MISO transmission planning. The rest of the slides will describe how reliability planning incorporates DERs. Thus far, we've used the MISO definition of DER, which includes distributed generation, distributed storage, and demand-side management. However, when we talk about reliability studies to demonstrate compliance with NERC standards, we must use the NERC definition of DER. NERC defines a distributed energy resource as any resource on the distribution system that produces electricity and is not otherwise included in the formal NERC definition of the bulk electric system. So, this includes distributed generation and distributed storage, as does the MISO definition. It also includes other classes of non-bulk electric system resources, like aggregations of multiple distributed generation and storage units microgrids, and cogeneration. However, it does not include demand-side management, which means that demand response, energy efficiency, and other load-modifying resources are not included in models for NERC compliance. NERC classifies DER as electricity-producing parts of the electric system. In the MISO framework, these can roughly be assumed to correlate to registered non-commercial pricing or non-CP node devices. However, not all NERC DER may be registered with MISO. Generally, demand-side management may be thought of as demand avoidance. In the MISO process, these would be unregistered and unmodeled for reliability models. Next. In reliability planning, engineers evaluate the performance of projects submitted by transmission owners to fix reliability issues in the system, according to NERC standards. Engineers also examine alternatives to these submitted projects and identify new reliability issues. For reliability planning, the assumptions related to DER really come from the assumptions made as part of the power flow modeling process. As I just discussed, this requires following the NERC definition. The data come into aforementioned models through submission by MISO transmission owners and load-serving entities. The gross load values are required to be submitted for the reliability planning models. Based on the registration status of existing or planned DERs, their modeling falls into several different categories. First, registered non-commercial pricing CP node generators make up what is often called behind-the-meter generation in reliability planning models. This accounts for about 5,000 megawatts in MISO. These are allowed for dispatch to serve load because they are registered with location. Legacy, embedded non-CP node resources have local existing contracts within the MISO footprint and are desirable from an engineering perspective. These are dispatched by data submitters to an appropriate level and are not altered by MISO's process. New resources should not appear in this category without discussion as to their circumstances. Non-registered non-CP node resources, this is the last one. Non-registered non-CP node resources may be existing or forecasted. They can be submitted as out-of-service negative loads in order to provide a more complete picture of what resources are available on the transmission distribution boundary. However, they are not available to be dispatched to serve load in the baseline reliability planning models. When it comes to non-generator DER resources, energy efficiency and demand response are not considered for baseline reliability models, following guidance from NERC. Next. One area of reliability planning where there might be misconceptions on the use of DER is in evaluation of non-transmission alternatives. When evaluating bottom-up projects, namely TO transmission owner submitted projects, NTAs are considered as an alternative to a specific defined transmission project. The focus of the NTA process is on contractual demand response or planned generator interconnections. The basic process is that reliability planners identify any projects that are eligible for NTA analysis. Stakeholders then submit NTA options, which are presented in sub-regional planning meetings or technical study task force meetings. If an NTA is pursued by a stakeholder and addresses the transmission issue, the transmission solution is no longer needed and the project can be withdrawn, deferred, or descoped. The stakeholder would move forward with the NTA and acquire all necessary contracts, and then the models would be updated for the next planning cycle. The NTA process was developed to allow for alternatives to transmission and was not focused on how DERs in general could provide energy and capacity. Next. To summarize, the treatment of DERs in reliability planning follows from the available information from a modeling perspective. There is an additional process to consider a DER as a specific alternative to a specific transmission project, but it doesn't apply more broadly. There is limited visibility of DERs in reliability planning. We anticipate that guidance from NERC will impact how DER are modeled and incorporated into reliability planning models in the future. If you want to stay up to date with any changes and assumptions, please tune in to the following stakeholder processes within MISO. If interested, Please reach out for more details on how these groups are engaging in DER discussion for MISO. Thank you for your time. Since we're doing questions at the end of the session, please go forward one more slide and we have some contact information with myself and our DER program manager, Kristen Swinson. Thank you, and that will conclude my presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Dan. That was very good and interesting and informative. The next speaker is Neil Miller, who is the Vice President of Transmission Planning and Infrastructure Development at California ISO, where he leads the division that's responsible for transmission planning, infrastructure, contracts, and the generation interconnection processes. Neil joined CAISO towards the end of 2010. Neil, take it away.
Sorry,
Neil, I believe you're
taking the mute off would have helped. Thanks, Lorenzo. I have quite a few slides, but I'm going to only be spending a minute on each of them, touching on some key points and then focusing on a few of particular interest. So next slide, please. Yes. So I just wanted to clarify that there are a number of processes that are shared between ourselves and the participating transmission owners in the ISO footprint. One of the two that we lead is the transmission expansion planning process, and that's where we'll be focusing today. Next slide, please. One of the key points, I've listed a few issues here, but one of the key points is the second bullet, which is the ISO's transmission planning process is the key mechanism for cost recovery for expansion-related transmission development to meet future needs, both regional policy as well as interregional development for the participating transmission owners. Next slide, please. So each year, the ISO goes through a three-stage transmission planning process. I will spend a bit more time on this slide because of its significance. The first phase is the development of our study assumptions that we're going to use in that year's plan. It includes testing the waters on what state and federal policy issues should be required to be studied in the program, as well as the bulk of our coordination with two key state agencies takes place in the development of our study plan. The California Energy Commission has responsibility within the state for producing demand forecasts and energy consumption forecasts. And we also turn to the Public Utilities Commission for planning generation resources and other common assumptions that would align with the Public Utility Commission's resource planning activities. I should also mention the Energy Commission's demand forecast includes not only gross consumption, but also the organically occurring load modifiers, including demand response, energy efficiency, and behind-the-meter generation resources. That takes place within the Energy Commission forecast. All of that work feeds each year into the phase 2, which is our sequential technical study process, where we walk through reliability analysis, policy-driven analysis, and then economic analysis to look for further opportunities to reduce ratepayer overall costs through any additional transmission development that might be beyond the basic requirements to meet reliability or policy-driven analysis. That culminates in us bringing a comprehensive plan to our board each March. If any of the projects that were identified in that plan are eligible for competitive solicitation, for competitive procurement, we then go through that phase 3 procurement cycle. But that only occurs if there are eligible projects. Next slide, please. This chart just plays out the sequential study process of feeding the Energy Commission and Utility Commission inputs into the transmission plan. In turn, the transmission plan also forms part of the CPUC's thinking and developing its own overall procurement direction. And then the process basically starts over again. So this is, well, we do our cycle every year. the state agencies have been trying to align to provide us annual results that we could use, even if certain of their processes focus on a biennial cycle. Next slide, please. This chart just lays out our study sequence of going through the reliability, policy, and economic-driven analysis. And at each stage, we're also looking at any proposed interregional transmission projects to assess if they may be a better option than our otherwise identified regional solution. And I should mention that there are opportunities for stakeholders throughout the iterative process to suggest alternatives or propose new solutions at each of these stages. Next slide, please. So the transmission planning process, even though it's called the transmission planning process, explores both conventional transmission solutions as well as non-transmission alternatives, which can include what in California are called preferred resources, or even mixes of conventional generation, preferred resources, and transmission. The only distinction is how they're treated. Our Board of Governors, in approving the plan, can approve moving forward with specific transmission projects. They can also agree with us that the identified non-transmission solution is the preferred option, in which case we then work with load-serving entities and the state regulators to do what we can to ensure that those resources are actually developed. Examples of this include the Oakland Clean Energy Initiative that I think is the subject of a later discussion. Southern California local capacity needs following the loss, the early retirement of the San Onofre Nuclear Generating Station a number of years ago. Moore Park, Santa Clara local capacity requirements, which generated a lot of interest in California, and a much smaller project called the Danuba Transmission Storage Device, which was a 7.5 megawatt storage project as well, meeting a transmission need. Next slide, please. Here we've just laid out the criteria for the competitive solicitation. It's I won't spend a lot of time on it today, but it's there if anyone's interested. Next slide, please. I did lay out a few of the challenges that are affecting our coordination with the state agencies here within California working on this initiative. Certainly the pace of renewable planning creates challenges, especially in considering renewable integration resources. This is a unprecedented time in terms of fleet transition from conventional resources over to renewables. So the pace is certainly a challenge. And managing any volatility in year-over-year forecasts when there's constant pressure to keep moving forward and meet new targets creates its own pressures. Permitting processes I've listed here too, because many of the state permitting processes enshrined in legislation were designed around an era of very gradual additions of resources to meet steady load growth, not managing sort of a wholesale fleet transition that we have in place now. They were also designed around processes where projects are being brought forward by investor-owned utilities who may have a commercial interest in the project, as opposed to an independent ISO who actually has no commercial interest. Now, the other thing we've noticed is we've been looking more at preferred resource solutions, such as different combinations of generation resource, is that normally when you build a transmission line, it gives you a step change in capacity that carries you for some number of years. So there's a surplus created that you gradually cut into. When you're planning around distributed resources in particular, we're getting exactly what the forecast said we need. So if there's any volatility in the forecast, there's a constant testing and perhaps recalibration of what the requirements are. Now, one area I was told that was of interest to a number of people participating in this process was a review we did a few years ago that led to the cancellation of a fairly large number of, albeit smaller, but a fairly large number of projects that added up to some material capital. Next slide, please. And in particular, this was this 3-year process that we had started back in 2015, doing a fairly comprehensive review of all of the approved projects in the PG&E service territory, one of our participating transmission owners. Most of these were below 200 kV. And a number of the projects had been approved a number of years earlier, some dating back as early as 2006. So while we normally do not go back and review the plan for previously approved projects, we update that information as we go into permitting processes. There were a number of circumstances here that were clearly outliers that warranted a separate and more comprehensive review. Next slide, please. Now, there were 3 main parameters that caused the review of these projects, and a number of them were affected not just by one in particular, but perhaps a number of the parameters. First, these projects had been sitting for some number of years. There had been steadily declining load forecasts, predominantly due to the success of the state's energy efficiency programs. There was also the situation where in a number of areas, distributed energy resources and behind the meter in solar in particular shifted the peak down from its conventional period in the middle of the afternoon to later in the day when solar no longer had an effect, and that created a bit of a one and done impact on pushing some additional downward pressure on peak demands, especially in local areas. The third item was that many of these projects had been approved at a time where solutions were identified and approved as soon as they appeared on the 10-year horizon. And that's one area where we made a deliberate shift, where we now only move forward with approving transmission projects when we reasonably expect the transmission owner to have to actually start permitting activities. Next slide, please. This is a graph of the year-over-year changes in the load forecasts from the Energy Commission. And until you hit the black line, the latest, the last forecast on the graph at the very bottom, that was the first year that the peak shift issue was taken into account. So peak demands, the entire trajectory was continually forecasted to drop year after year, progressively lower trajectories. Then there was a risk of overshoot because the forecasting methodology at the time was still focusing on the middle of the afternoon historical peak load period. The solar resources were obviously having a major impact on the behind the meter side, but then we did have to also ensure that we didn't overshoot because of the later day load levels that were not that much lower than the middle of the afternoon. And those later day load levels were not seriously affected by the behind the meter solar. Oh, next slide, please. This is a picture that it was actually out of the San Diego gas and electric service territory, some data that showed the impact where as the behind the meter solar picked up, the peak shifted from middle of the afternoon to the early evening when that load level became the peak. So this is not uncommon. This is happening quite a bit in the system as well as to our summer peak loads overall, given how behind the meter solar has taken off so quickly in California. Next slide, please. So that this ultimately led over the 3-year review, and then we had to touch up a few more projects in a 4th year. It resulted in canceling 50 projects out of originally at the time we would have been looking. That was about a third of the PG&E projects that were on the books at the time. So a major impact, taking out 50 projects and rescoping 22 others over the course of the program. Next slide, please. One project in particular that garnered a lot of attention, and it really did highlight the impact of storage and solar resources working together, was we did approve a 230 kV transmission line project back in 2013. It was reliability focused, but it also provided economic benefits. And the purpose of the project was really to provide additional pumping capability at the Helms pump generating station, pump storage facility, so that Helms itself could also provide a bigger contribution to meeting peak loads. Next slide. What occurred over time, though, is the blue line here represents the forecast load shape for 2030 that was seen back in the 2013 timeframe. The orange line represents the 2018 forecast shape for the same 2030 period. What this shows is the impact of the behind-the-meter solar. And what the behind-the-meter solar did was provide enough energy through the middle of the afternoon that it created the additional pumping opportunities for the Helms unit, as well as also serving some of the local load itself. So that enabled capacity at Helms on a daily basis to be recharged so that Helms would be available to meet peak load needs in the area. So this was a case of, normally we're thinking of trying to locate now storage to where there is solar. This was a case of the solar migrating around where there already was a large storage facility and getting the combined benefits. Now, I thought this would be a good example just to show the kind of impact this type of project can have. It doesn't show up all the time, but it can have an impact, and each case really needs to be considered individually. So that's the end of the material I have today. I'll look forward to questions later.
Excellent. Thank you, Neil. We'll go on to the next speaker now, who is Nick Chassett. Nick is the Chief Executive Officer of Alameda County's new Community Choice Energy Agency. So Community Choice, for those of you not familiar, in California essentially allows local governments to form essentially retail providers of electric service to their territories. East Bay Community Energy serves Alameda County, which is on the east side of the San Francisco Bay. Nick was instrumental in all aspects of formation of EBCE, bringing with him over a decade of energy.
Come here.
Come here.
Sorry, my dog is rooting around. She's not supposed to be.
Oh dear. I didn't know he was interested in transmission. East Bay Community Energy started service to the county businesses and municipalities in the county in June 2018, with residential service for 11 of cities and counties and so on. In 2021, it's going to be expanding to include other cities in nearby Newark, Pleasanton, and Tracy. So before that, Nick was at the California Public Utilities Commission for quite a while, where he served as chief of staff to Michael Picker when he was president of the commission. And before that, special advisor to Governor Jerry Brown, focusing on distributed resources. So Nick, I hand it over to you. Please proceed.
Thank you very much, Lorenzo. So I am today going to talk about a specific example of a transmissions to distributed energy resource integration. It's a project East Bay Community Energy has been working on with PG&E for some time. I will sort of share this disclaimer. This is really an overview of the EBCE experience. Because it was jointly procured, we actually have two separate contracts. They are separately negotiated, so they don't know the specific terms of ours, that we don't know the specific terms of theirs. The primary areas of actually feedback between EBC and PG&E were from the CAISO, and the CAISO kind of giving us a clear set of directions that this project would meet the transmission requirements that it sought to meet. So next slide, please. So here's an agenda. I won't read through it, but I think it gives a good overview of things. So next slide, please. So the Oakland Clean Energy Initiative started out as an effort to replace an aging peaker plant that had been in West Oakland since the 1970s. This project has been operating for so long that the unit has been reaching its useful life for some time and has been operating on what we in California call a reliability must-run basis. So it's really a year-to-year contract that reflects the fact that there is a distinct and clear system need in this area, but does not really provide the necessary support to make a long-term investment. We are sort of at a place over the last number of years with the Dynegy plant where there were really three options that had to be pursued. One was repowering the aging power plant with something new. The challenge there obviously is tremendous community opposition to building a new fossil plant, particularly in a community like West Oakland that already is heavily impacted by the Port of Oakland air pollution. The second solution was to build a large transmission line through Oakland. So you can imagine there would be tremendous challenges to permit a transmission line built through a densely populated urban area. And then the third opportunity was really this OCEI, which was mixing a number of transmission upgrades, so not new line, but transmission upgrades to the existing system with a portfolio of clean, innovative solutions. And I think for obvious reasons, this was the preferred approach, not simply I think because it was clean or innovative, but I think from a viability perspective, really was the approach that had the highest likelihood of success to deliver the necessary reliability. So EBCE entered into a partnership and issued a solicitation for really all sources, not just energy storage, but generation, energy efficiency, and demand response. These resources had to be sited in the downtown and west parts of Oakland. And so we issued that solicitation in the spring of 2018. And we started contracting for those resources at the beginning or mid 2019. Next slide, please. So what this shows is sort of a sense of where this project is located. If you're not from the Bay Area, this may not mean a tremendous amount, but I think one thing that is really kind of nice to sort of recognize is, this is a densely populated area, and on the bottom right-hand side of this slide, you see the storage tanks. Those storage tanks hold jet fuel. So you can imagine from a community perspective, not only there's a concern about the air pollution, but just the safety challenges of, huge jet fuel tanks in an area that is surrounded by residential homes. Next slide, please. So, one of the things I think we've was identified as, the challenge here is this was a unit that did not run very often. But when it was needed, it was really needed to sort of provide that marginal level of reliability. And so while this plant, is 160 megawatts in size, I think that the thinking from the CAISO's perspective, and certainly from EBC and PG's, was we didn't need to come up with a one-for-one, megawatt replacement. We really needed something that was tailored to the new loads. Next slide, please. So as Neil mentioned, this project was entered into the transmission plan, and so the specific details of this project were iterated through the transmission plan. I think one of the things that we saw there that was interesting is the initial quantity of energy storage that we contracted had to change over the last year, because as the TPP proceeded, the needs changed as the load forecast and other factors came into play. And we actually ended up having to increase the size of the project from 27 megawatts to 43 megawatts. So we increased it by 16 megawatts of energy storage. Next slide, please. Okay, next slide. So one of the innovative aspects of this whole project was finding a way to jointly procure between PG&E and PG&E and sort of identify this value stack. So on the East Bay community energy side of things, we sought to procure more traditional energy products. Resource adequacy, which is in California, what others in other states might refer to as capacity. RECs, so renewable energy credits, to the degree that new generation would have been part of the portfolio, we would have procured the RECs, and also to the degree that we wanted to toll the batteries or buy generation, we sought to buy energy. We limited eligibility because of the small geographic footprint to front of the meter renewables, so most likely solar, front of the meter storage, and behind the meter storage. Next slide, please. I would say, we certainly did learn a lot through the process. I think we went into the process with PG&E in particular, not really knowing exactly where we would land. Really it was a hope that we could figure out a way to partner to solve a persistent environmental and grid reliability challenge. And I think one of the things that we found was having that regular conversation with the CAISO around the project, and kind of a willingness and recognition that there would have to be iteration around the project. So the first sets of contracts we signed, we recognized early on may not be the last ones, because this is something that the CAISO would continually have to get comfortable with in their planning process. So that was definitely, I think, a benefit and a really positive lesson learned. And then there's the coordination with PG&E around the contracting process. Because we can't jointly contract, we can't sort of jointly negotiate. It was at times a bit of a challenge to coordinate timing, but having that kind of very collegial relationship, one that's really working towards a uniform goal, I think is something that kind of helped us get this project over the line. As you might imagine, jointly procuring a resource when you can't share critical documents does raise some meaningful challenges. I think frankly the management of confidentiality was really one of the most challenging things. Not being able to share with PG&E exact details of our expectations for online dates until we had finalized the contracts, or PG&E being able to share with us some of their planning protocols. I think led to some growing pains, but I think overall the fact that we were able to partner with PG&E to get this 40 plus megawatt in front of the meter energy storage project done, and through the CAISO process, kind of reflects the fact that these types of opportunities, they're certainly out there. There's a lot of aging gas on the system, and finding ways for retailers and distribution providers to partner to get there, I think, is critical to the energy transition. Next slide, please. Next slide. So in terms of the contracts we signed 3 contracts. The largest was with Vistra. So the owner of the peaker was developing an energy storage facility that would be co-located at the site of the peaker. As one can imagine, the fact that they have the existing interconnection capacity and the clear line of sight to, if we can develop the storage, we can more quickly shut down the peaker plant, was definitely a benefit of that partnership. The second project was developed by ES Volta, a much smaller 7 megawatt. And I will say all of these projects are 4-hour batteries. And then finally, we did do a behind the meter solar and storage that, we look at sort of a pilot project and one that we're actually currently in the process of scaling up from 500 to 10 megawatts. And in this particular case, this is 500 kilowatts of effectively demand response, but demand response that's powered by the behind the meter solar and storage systems. In this particular instance, also, all of the sites that are participating in the Sunrun program are low income multifamily residences. And so, at least in our community, this was a real priority for us to figure out how do we partner with the solar industry to develop behind the meter resources that are useful from a grid perspective for us, that we can count towards our resource adequacy obligations, while also delivering clear benefits to our most most at risk and most needy customers. And so that was the structure that we entered into with Sunrun, and I think we're waiting to see the projects come online, but we're really excited about the potential for relying on behind the meter increasingly for grid resources. As Neil mentioned in his presentation, we have a tremendous amount of rooftop solar in California, and one of the challenges is the vast majority of that capacity does not respond to the needs of the grid. I think as we can start to change that paradigm, we're not only going to be able to allow the next million solar roofs to occur, but we're going to do it in a way that's a lot more financially and reliable, and from a grid reliability perspective, better. Next slide, please. I guess that's it. All right, well, there you go. That's the Oakland Clean Energy Initiative for you. I will say just, my last comment is we have already learned lessons from this project about the interplay between grid reliability and behind the meter. And as I said, we are in the process of finalizing a 10 megawatt contract for somewhere in the order of 3,000 behind the meter solar and storage systems that we're going to be able to have dispatch rights over to on an annual basis, modify our load and reduce our capacity obligations.
Excellent. Thanks, Nick. Really, really informative example. So we'll move now to the last speaker, Doug Scott. Doug is Vice President for Electricity and Efficiency at the Great Plains Institute. And in that role, Doug works on issues involving the changing utility business model, climate strategy and regulatory response, carbon capture, sequestration, and usage, quite a variety of things. Prior to joining Great Plains Institute in 2015, Scott was chairman of the Illinois Commerce Commission, and prior to that, director of the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency. So Scott is now working on the Midwestern Mid-Grid project, which he will talk to us about. Go ahead, Doug.
Great, thanks, Lorenzo. Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be with you. Appreciate the chance to be on the webinar today. Also appreciate the chance to be working on the NARUC NASEO task force. So some very exciting issues that we're exploring there. So I appreciate being part of that. This is going to be a little bit different, not just because I'm the only one who doesn't have slides, but also because it's slightly different in that this is more of a process to help be more integrated with the MISO processes that Dan talked about a little bit earlier. So the Midwestern Governors Association is a group of states, as you might imagine, in the Midwest, and each year, whoever is the head of that organization, whichever governor is the head of that, gets to designate a project that they want to work on. And this year, the president of the organization is Governor Reynolds of Iowa, and the vice chair of the organization is Governor Walz of Minnesota. And they both decided that what they really wanted to work on this year was transmission issues. and try to figure out if there is something larger that could be done within the MGA states. And so the idea behind the Midgrid 2035 project, which is an initiative of the Midwestern Governors Association, came about. MGA reached out to us at Great Plains Institute. We have not only done a lot of work in transmission, principally in MISO over the years, but we've done a lot of projects with MGA and worked on them on a variety of different things over the years. So we were brought on to facilitate this process, which got started late last year. And of course, with the virus, like most things, it's changed a little bit. We started off working with doing some individual calls and in-person meetings with the states to kind of figure out what their transmission needs are, and to talk about that in the context of, are there things that could be done from a planning process that would help them meet some of their states' goals, and are there things that are shared goals that then could be done amongst a group of states. So that's the premise behind the Midgrid process. Not all of the MGA states are part of Midgrid, and not all of the states that are participating in Midgrid are part of MGA. So it really is kind of a Midwestern mix to it that includes about 8 or 9 states that we've been working with so far, about 10 states that we've been working with so far, a lot of whom are part of the NARUC NASEO process as well. So you might remember a few years back, the multi-value projects in MISO. I know Dan probably remembers it very well, but with the idea of trying to figure out at that time, all of the states, or a lot of states in the Midwest, were coming up with renewable portfolio standards, and one of the goals MISO was trying to work on at that time was, well, how do we make all of these RPS goals that states have? How do we get the transmission system to work with them and try to help them achieve their goals? And so the idea behind the multi-value projects came up. The last of those, it was a process that took quite a while. In fact, the last of those projects was just permitted by Wisconsin back a few months ago. So it's really taken, really took the better part of 10 years to get those projects up and going. But the idea behind the MVP was that, there was some mutually shared goals amongst a lot of states. It's a little different now. And so one of the things that we're trying to do with Midgrid is to try to address individual state needs, see what those might be, and then also see if there are some shared goals. So there's not that kind of one driving, unifying thing like there was back in the MVP time where we're working on the RPSs. And so again, other things have been talking about DER in this presentation. Midgrid is not specific to DER. It's whatever the individual state groups what the individual states are looking for, and whether or not we can have some shared goals. So the idea, though, is to try to align as best we can state and RTO planning, and the fact that there are states here that are in not just MISO, but also some states that are in both MISO and PJM, some states that are in MISO and SPP, and so MISO, SPP, and PJM have all been a part of this process from the beginning, as we're talking about, because part of the goal also, frankly, is to see if there are issues between the RTOs that some planning needs can help states meet their goals, but also try to help with a more unified planning between the RTOs as well. Some of the things that the themes that come through that when we started talking to the states that we would learn about, one, the nature of state needs is evolving fairly rapidly. There's a lot of new generation coming on, a lot of wind, a lot of solar that's coming in. A lot of states want that. They welcome that for a variety of reasons. It could be environmental. It could be clean energy goals that they have. It could also be because they see it as an economic development tool to try to recruit businesses that want substantial portions of their energy to be clean energy. So for a variety of reasons, generation mix is changing. We're seeing it all over. You know, even in states that don't look at it from a climate standpoint, you're starting to see a real change in the generation mix because utilities are frankly doing that. They see customer needs. You know, there are a whole bunch of reasons for that probably the subject of another webinar. But so states are seeing the changing needs and wondering if the transmission system is matching up to that changing generation resource. The solutions are changing, more planning, a lot of changes in the planning system that states are employing, not just the RTOs. And the continued rising cost of the transmission footprint. The annual spend now, even without MVP projects, is about $4 billion a year. Is there a way to flatten that spending curve that we've talked about? Optimization is something that's very important to a lot of states. Invest as efficiently as possible, combine short and long-term needs and goals, and look for non-transmission solutions where possible as well. The group has decided, at least at this point, not to go into cost allocation issues. Obviously a very important but very contentious issue as well. There is a group at the organization of MISO states is actually looking at cost allocation issues as a group right now. And so the Midgrid for this point has decided not to look into that as well, although they are looking at kind of an iterative approach, which is looking at the back and forth between costs and needs, obviously. And obviously it's going to have to be done at some point. Cost allocation is going to need to be done at some point. The group came up with a vision statement. And part of the reason we don't have slides is there just isn't a lot that's kind of out there with this group so far, because it's still in its stage where it's trying to figure out you know, what the work plan is going forward. But they did come up with a vision statement talking about some of the things that you would imagine: reliability, efficiency, as I just mentioned, utilize the current transmission structure to the greatest extent possible. And within the context of each state's long-term planning needs, trying to support meaningful public engagement and try to minimize siting challenges. That's been a lot of the discussion that's been up there with the group as well. And again, looking at a variety of things, not just wires alternatives, but looking at a variety of solutions and develop recommendations through a transparent stakeholder process. Again, not just in MISO, but also in PJM and SPP and between the RTOs as well. At a phase 2 kickoff meeting, brought in some other stakeholders for their perspectives on transmission planning and development needs. The work plan going forward, as I mentioned, is something that's being prepared. We expect this group to go on in some form. As I mentioned, there's a yearly process where the incoming chair can pick out, the incoming governor can pick out his or her project that they want to work on. But a lot of times projects will continue on even past the 1-year period, and I would expect that Midgrid 2035 will do that as well. I think the group feels it's really important for states to have a say and try to influence planning, whether it's in something like Midgrid, or you're seeing that the Committee of States in SPP and the Committee of States in MISO are working on a joint SEAMS committee now and have been for some time. So you're seeing states really engaging in the transmission planning process as well. There are a lot of differences. I mentioned this earlier, but I think it's really important to hit on again. There are a lot of differences in state transmission needs. You know, and some of them have to do with their geography. Some have to do with the political structure in a particular state, the generation mix and the philosophy about that generation mix. Are they an exporter or an importer of generation? Are they in a single RTO, or are they in multiple RTOs? The SEAMS issues between the RTOs is obviously very important. Even within MISO, there are some issues between the northern part of MISO and the southern part of MISO. So trying to take all of these needs into account. And then you've got some of the biggest needs in a short-term basis are really localized congestion or pricing needs that you might find in one part of the footprint for the RTO. It matters whether states are vertically integrated or competitive, and what are some of the state statutes that they have. There's one of the states that's involved that has not only an in-state preference, but an in-state mandate for renewable energy and a fairly high RPS goal, but an in-state mandate for renewable energy to be in their state. And so their transmission needs are maybe very different than the state next door that wants to move as much renewable energy as they can into other states. So it's obviously a tough job for the RTO in planning, and you know, Dan did a great job talking about the different assumptions that they use and the different scenarios that they try to run. But again, you know, we think that this process can actually help the RTOs by providing maybe some of the context, some of the other things that states would like the RTOs to look at, not just the things that are on the books or the things that could be reasonably anticipated, as you saw from some of the assumptions Dan talked about earlier. There are changes all the time to laws governing renewable energy and other things that might affect transmission. We at GPI are working with many states that are looking at making some fairly significant changes, you know, to their laws as a way to try to either support clean energy or to accomplish some other goals. You know, the utilities have major decarbonization goals, and virtually every state in the group has at least one utility that has a major decarbonization or GHG reduction goal. And the question becomes how to react to that, how to do the planning for that. So, you know, if there's no state IRP, how does that fit into the process? So all of the things, frankly, all the things we're talking about in the NARUC NASEO task force, and all the things that states talk about all the time, and all the things the RTOs talk about all the time. The idea here is now we've brought in stakeholders in addition to the states for them to be able to weigh in on the planning process and what's needed. And hopefully what we'll end up with is a work product that will enhance the planning process from the RTOs. That's certainly the goal. And to get the governors and frankly the states more involved to the extent that they can and want to in the planning process. You know, recognizing that if you've got significant goals, either in economic development or in clean energy, that transmission is a huge part of that. And so to the extent possible, both in terms of short-term goals and in terms of long-term goals, trying to intersect with the planning process that the RTOs have. So that's the goal of Midgrid 2035. I realize it's a little different than some of the other things we've been talking about today, but as the other speakers have said, I'm glad to be here and happy to take questions about the process. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much, Doug. That was very informative. So we'll move into Q&A mode right now, and I'm seeing that Danielle has some questions that she's raised, and I'll hand it over to her momentarily, but I think I'd like to lead off with one myself for all of the panelists, in a way, a theme that's been of interest to most of the task force participants in the almost a year and a half now that we've been working together has been about stakeholder engagement. What activities in planning are facing the public? What opportunities do stakeholders have to participate and be heard and give input and so on? And I'm working on the question I'm thinking about is in the case of Neil and Dan, to talk a little bit about the explicit opportunities in your ISO RTO processes for stakeholder engagement. And maybe the aspect of this question for Nick would be, how do you, as a load serving entity now who is a stakeholder in a sense, what's the importance of transmission planning to your organization, and how do you participate in that? And then, you know, similarly for Doug, you mentioned bringing more stakeholders in. So I think I'll let it go in whichever order you like, but just to talk a little bit about stakeholder engagement opportunities.
Doug, did you want to start that off?
I'm happy to
Yeah, sure.
jump in there if you want, Lorenzo. This is Nick.
Oh.
Go ahead, Neil.
Oh, no, I was looking to see if we just wanted to do the same order, but I
Perfect.
can
Let's do it.
Sure.
All right, so Dan, I guess, go first.
Okay, sounds good. Well, you know, MISO has a variety of stakeholder meetings monthly, and there's many opportunities for stakeholder engagement, and we're extremely interested in working with our stakeholders on a variety of our operations in order to best serve the footprint. We have a calendar that's on our website, and it's you know, you just take a look. It's filled with plenty of forums and venues for all different levels of committees and areas, DR being just one. You know, with MISO representing such a vast and diverse footprint, you know, working with stakeholders is something that's really helpful to us. You know, the footprint stretches some 15 states. It's over 40 million people, all the way to Southeast Texas. So that's an area where we really strive to maximize stakeholder involvement and work collaboratively in order to continue to serve the footprint.
Thanks, Dan. Neil.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. It's Neil here. Yeah, so each one of our annual transmission planning cycles has 4 discrete stakeholder opportunities at key milestones, so that we get to a certain point, we present those results to stakeholders, collect feedback, collect suggestions and alternatives, then move into the next stage. So after our study plan, or when our study plan is in draft form, that's presented and then adapted. After our reliability analysis, preliminary results are presented and stakeholder suggestions for alternatives are taken in. We also have another step after our policy analysis is available, and then when the comprehensive plan also shows the economic study results as well. So very high dependence on stakeholder feedback as we move through each annual cycle.
Thanks, Neil. Nick?
Yes. So, you know, in the context of the transmission planning process, our LSC typically operates in concert with the other CCAs through our trade association, CAL, Community Choice. And so, you know, there we have consultants, and, you know, they're providing comments and, you know, making recommendations along with all other stakeholders. We have a lot of stakeholder engagement within our LSC because we are a public agency serving a discrete service territory. You know, a project like the Oakland Clean Energy Initiative went through multiple rounds of public meetings with members of the community to gather input on everything from the parameters for workforce development around our procurement to the types of technologies that we may want to procure.
Great, thank you. Doug, do you want to add anything on that?
Sure. You know, having been you know, I was a chair of a utility commission in Illinois for a few years, and we were in both MISO and PJM. But I was not the representative for the state committee, either for OMS or for OPSI. And it was really difficult for me, even as interested and trying to be tuned in and trying to accomplish a lot of different things, it was difficult to keep up with all that goes on. I think Dan talked about the number of stakeholder processes that there are in MISO, and there are a tremendous number of them, and there are in PJM, and there are in SPP as well. In fact, we have one guy on GPI staff who spends a lot of his week just listening in on various meetings at MISO. And it's a lot to keep up with. And I think from a state perspective, even from a commission standpoint, where they have members that are assigned to the different committees, it's really difficult to keep up with everything that's going on at the RTO. And I don't say that to be pejorative toward the RTOs or the ISOs. I mean, they do have lots of stakeholder groups and they try to get lots of engagement. It's really difficult for a lot of states too, though, that don't necessarily have staff that can help. In Illinois, we were fortunate because we had staff who were paying attention to what was going on at both MISO and PJM. A lot of commissions aren't large enough to have that luxury of having that staff. And so I think one of the things that we want to do with Midgrid 2035 is to help bridge that gap to the extent that we can. And if the problem's that acute at the commission level, it's probably even more acute at levels like the governor's offices, certainly the legislatures, and other places where some of the intricacies of the RTOs are really lost on state government. So again, not a criticism of the RTOs as much as it is just kind of a reality where states are and why a project like Midgrid 2035 would attract a lot of states to it, just because there's a great educational opportunity both for the states and for the RTOs.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. I got a note from Dan. He'd like to add one more point. Dan, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Lorenzo. I'd like to add just supplementary information on our calendar that was just pinged out, I think. For any of those stakeholder meetings, agendas are published several days in advance for anyone to evaluate if they want to step into the conversation and take the time to attend those meetings. And just one final thing, I want to thank and compliment Doug for giving such a great description of the myriad considerations that MISO as an RTO has when discussing the future of transmission planning, and just his overall recap of the Midgrid initiative was just great. So thank you, Doug.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Let me invite my co-moderator, Brooke Tucker, to weigh in with any questions she might like to raise. Brooke.
Sorry, can you guys hear me now?
Yep. Yes.
Well, thank you so much for the presentations. Really appreciated your comments. And I think my overarching question for those of us, I think there are a number of us on the NARUC NASEO task force, if each of the panelists would be willing to weigh in with one thing that they feel would help this task force translate into real success in the real world, what would that recommendation be for those of us on the task force?
I suppose I have to go first again. Okay, this is Dan. I would say for the task force to share tools, methods, and processes that it uses to collect information about the use of DER. Like I said before, MISO is not interested in modeling the distribution system, but one thing we're working on is our methods, processes, tools, and collaboratively, I might add, in conjunction with our member utilities and member states to gather that information at an appropriate level. So that's one thing I would speculate would be helpful, at least to MISO from this task force.
Okay, Neil, what would you add to that?
Sure. This advice is offered somewhat tentatively, but I would suggest that for a number of the issues we're talking about, they're not occurring just on their own or because of solely economic drivers, but often as a matter of some sort of policy driver behind it. I'd always encourage people to look at seeing what they can do to align, to consider the policy drivers that are occurring, and to the extent that they're consistent between regions, or in this case, between states, to consider how best to consolidate that type of direction, given how much we're doing. We are moving into a lot of uncharted territory on the types of resources that are emerging, So we can't just count on the tools of the past being sufficient for what we're dealing with in the future. So really strong consideration of the policy drivers that are affecting the pace of development of some of these resources, I think, tend to leave people in a better position to help considering their other infrastructure requirements.
Yeah, thanks for that, Neil. Let me just make a comment, I think, is that it may not be that obvious the extent to which a state's resource planning becomes a driver of transmission needs. And so that's an area where better communication of the resource preferences that the state is pursuing are valuable input into the transmission planning process. Nick, what would you like to add?
I think one of the things that I've learned, especially in the last few years, in focusing on trying to, enhance the ability of distributed energy to play in wholesale markets is, we need to start moving increasingly away from sort of deterministic planning and, be more and more willing to rely on market prices. I think one of the things we tend to get when we think about sort of this deterministic planning is we tend to just focus on the solutions that we know, whereas when we allow price formation to drive resource decisions, you tend to unleash more innovation. And it also provides more certainty too. So I think that might be surprising to hear from a Californian, but I think it's something that we in California need to be increasingly willing to accept, and that may mean things like moving away from paradigms like resource adequacy towards more energy only types of approaches.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good one. Resource adequacy is a struggle in California, which I'm involved in to some extent, and it is a question of a paradigm that was well suited to one particular industry structure, but is now coming under challenge from change in the resource mix, and especially distributed resources. Doug, you want to add anything on that question?
Sure. And I get to cheat a little bit because I'm part of the task force, so I get, but I think one of the important things would be the timing of different processes that are out there. That's one of the things that we've been looking at in our cohort, and as best as we can try to figure out what timing makes the most sense, where the processes, all of the different processes between states and RTOs, how do they all line up or not line up in some cases, and are there ways that we can try to better align the different processes and the timing requirements for them? Because it's one thing for states to plan and it's another thing for the RTOs to plan, but if they don't match up and they can't feed into each other's processes, that makes it really, really difficult. And the other thing, to the earlier point that was made, a lot of states don't have an IRP. So they don't even, they're not doing resource planning, on a regular basis. Even states that are vertically integrated don't all have IRPs. So that may be something else to think about from a task force perspective.
Yeah, thank you very much. Brooke, did you want to add anything else or ask another question?
No, just thank you for the advice, and just appreciate the insights of the speakers.
Okay, then let me call on Danielle to pose questions in the remaining time.
Thank you, Lorenzo, and thank you, speakers. I am speaking on behalf of folks who have typed in questions, but happy to ask those. Let's see. We have, I think, one for each of our speakers, and we'll see if we can get to them all. Question for Neil. What did you learn from the 3-year retrospective review of previously approved projects that is now being applied to your current transmission planning processes? And are there opportunities for commissions or energy offices, recognizing you're obviously working in California, but if you could dig a little bit more broadly as you just were, are there opportunities for those types of agencies to provide information to the ISO that supports future planning in a way that would help avoid the need for such a retrospective in the future?
Oh, thank you. I think the most important part here was the need to keep an open mind about some of the evolving patterns and economic issues that were affecting the state. The level of renewable generation penetration was far beyond what was originally being projected. And as we move into more of these use-limited resources where the solar production, wonderful source of energy, but a very specific time of day, and then it's gone. That required broader consideration of not just peak load and energy requirements, but actually developing a whole methodology around load shapes that put a huge burden on our Energy Commission to adapt their forecasting. So the sooner you see some of those trends emerge and get on them, the better. So it really involves looking at not only the circumstances you're dealing with now, but where it might lead in the future. The other thing we really emphasize, though, is the tight coordination we have with the state agencies. That's been invaluable to us as we move forward.
Great, thank you very much for your response there. Let's see, we have another one for Nick. Nick, given the challenges you faced in not being able to share information and documents with PG&E, were there any things that the Commission, the Energy Office, or state legislature, I suppose, could have done to make the process easier for you to coordinate with PG&E and smooth out the process that you went through for procurement?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think the one thing I did not cover in my presentation, but is relevant to this question is PG&E assigned a contract, East Bay Community Energy assigned a contract. The project has been approved within the context of the transmission planning process, but it still is now having to go through the regulatory approval at the PUC. And so I think finding ways to, which provides an added layer of uncertainty and could lead to further changes. I think finding ways to provide, more clear pre-approval, as long as if projects of this kind, innovative clean energy projects, meet certain clear pricing hurdles ahead of time, they are deemed approved by the Commission and don't require sort of a subsequent application process. I think that would be a really useful approach to consider given the novel nature of the Oakland Clean Energy Initiative.
Thank you, Neil. Nick, that's very helpful. There's also another question for you about how you have evaluated alternatives, if you've been using installed costs, established cost-benefit evaluation, or other value streams from the solution.
We have not, been looking at an avoided cost solution. We held an all-source solicitation. Well, not truly all-source, right? We weren't considering gas resources, and there was limited, really, ability because of some of the parameters from the CAISO to consider certain behind the meter. But I would say, we held an eligible source given the constraints that we were facing, solicitation, and we picked the most economic bids from those parameters. I think some of that had to do with the fact that the alternatives, say a new gas plant, were considered non-viable from a permitting perspective, and so it's not really appropriate to compare costs to a solution that isn't really going to have a shot.
Okay, so by economic, you're talking about specifically on a per megawatt?
Per megawatt, right? Yeah, dollars per megawatt. So we were looking at dollars per megawatt. Yep.
Great, thank you. Doug, there was a question here for you. Could you talk a little about cost allocation methodologies being considered within the mid-grid group when you're talking about transmission options?
Yeah, that's been a difficult difficult area, Danielle. In the MVP process that I talked about, that was a particularly contentious piece, and states were in very different places on that cost allocation methodology. So this group specifically hasn't wanted to talk about that from that perspective, but they do want to talk about costs from the standpoint of more of a cost benefit analysis of looking at different ways to try to solve some of their needs. And that may be non-transmission, that may be not non-wires alternatives, as we talked about. It may be some efficiency things that can be done. So there is the need to talk about that. And as the work plan develops further, I'm sure there will be, as I described earlier, more of an iterative process with the RTO, kind of a back and forth about what would make the most, or the RTOs, I should say, about what would make the most sense for as ways to look at particular projects. But in terms of the kind of the overall cost allocation question, as I said, MISO's organization of states is taking that up right now on kind of a broader level, and that's probably where it belongs. Maybe a little difficult in a group like ours to talk through that, but costs definitely become important as you start talking about, you know, what are the best ways to solve particular issues. MVP was different because you were essentially talking about a transmission solution to try to help the RPS goals. And so there was kind of a shared purpose there. This one's a little bit different because the needs are very different for the states, and some of them are short-term and some of them are long-term. So the cost discussion is going to be a little bit more difficult. Sorry, that's the best answer I could do right now.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Sure.
I think in the last couple of minutes, we had a couple of threads related to the resource adequacy points that you all were making. So I'm going to ask them of anyone who would like to respond, and this is sort of a 2 or 3-parter here. So first, there was a question that was directed at Nick, but I think is also relevant for Neil, around resource adequacy and how you all looked at load shape and contingency or abnormal N-1 conditions. And then a related note came through from one of our friends in New York. Have any of the panelists been following what's happening in New York? We have underway a major rethinking of how to conduct transmission planning to support our 70 by 30 and 100 by 40 goals. We're also conducting a look at our current resource adequacy market construct. Do you have advice from California specifically on resource adequacy constructs that may work in deregulated markets? And that question was directed to anyone. Please jump in.
Well, I can jump in about load modification. You know, I think one of the things we've been focused on at East Bay Community Energy is working with particularly the California Energy Commission, who conducts the load forecast, to develop processes that more clearly account for contracted and controllable behind the meter resources. So, you know, today, if you have a battery behind the meter, the load modification credit that you get is done, is applied generically, not specifically to the supply plan that you may have for that resource. And so what we've been working on is a process whereby on an annual basis, to the degree that we have, say, 5, 10, 15, 20 more megawatts of contracted and controllable behind the meter resources, we can file a supply plan for them that operates to permanently modify our load during the period of the supply plan, so annually. So it allows us to get more full benefits and more full credit for those behind the meter resources that we control.
Thanks. Did anyone else want to weigh in on the resource adequacy point in our last minute or so?
Well, it's Neil here. I would just add that when it comes to resource adequacy programs, some of the crediting systems that used to work when the type of resources we're talking about were relatively small volume, really need careful examination because the load shapes are very important, and getting the right resources and the right combination of resources is very critical. So just counting on a particular basket or a particular type of resource, putting it bluntly, just doesn't work going forward, as we need to be more flexible in how we assess contributions those different resources can make. And like I said, to do that, the load shape you're serving is critical to understanding what your options are.
It sounds like we're about out of time. Yes, Danielle or anyone on the core team want to have any last comment, or anyone on the panel would like to make a last comment?
This is Brooke. Just thank you to the speakers again. I just found it very informative and look forward to taking what I've learned back to the task force.
Yeah. Excellent. So thank you all very much. I really appreciate the panelists putting the time into preparing and giving really helpful presentations. The task force and everyone appreciates your input greatly, and thank you very much. Have a good rest of your afternoon.
Thanks. See you.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.